Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable and remarkably stressed life of Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, who ruled an empire, terrified her advisors, and spent most of her reign pretending she wasn't slowly falling apart. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's royal misery together. It's the year 1533, and you've just been born into the Tudor dynasty. Congratulations. You've officially entered the world's most chaotic family business. Your father is Henry VIII, a man who believes he's been personally appointed by God to rule England and destroy the concept of stable relationships. Your mother, Anne Boleyn, is witty, ambitious, and currently the most hated woman in Europe. Together, they've produced you, a baby girl, which is already the first diplomatic crisis of your life. Everyone was expecting a boy, a strong heir, a future king. Instead, out you come, wrapped in royal linen and disappointment. The midwives murmur, healthy and beautiful, but what your father hears is useless for succession. You've been alive for 5 minutes and you've already let him down. An impressive start, really. Your christening is lavish because it has to be. Courtiers line up to pretend they're thrilled. Trumpets blare, priests bless, and half the guests are trying not to laugh. There's polite applause for the princess, who, according to rumour, ruined her mother's chances of keeping her head attached. Even the godparents look like they're wondering if it's too soon to ask for transfers. For a brief moment, things go well. You have your own nursery, silk blankets, and a team of servants who definitely gossip about you the second they leave the room. You're fed, clothed, and occasionally acknowledged. Luxury by Tudor standards. Then, 2 years later, your father gets bored, your mother gets accused of witchcraft, and your household suddenly downsizes. When you're 2, your mother walks up to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Her crime? Failing to give Henry a boy and daring to have opinions. The axe falls, and with it, your status. Overnight, you go from Her Royal Highness to the King's awkward mistake. Henry marries again within weeks, because grief is inefficient. You're left in the care of strangers who hope you don't remind anyone you exist. But here's the thing. You're a Tudor. You inherit the family curse, survival through spite. You'll grow up quiet, clever, and terrifyingly patient. And one day, you'll make the world regret laughing at your birth. You grow up learning what every Tudor woman learns eventually. You're only valuable until you aren't. And since your mother's been executed and your father's moved on to wife number 3, your value has dropped somewhere between royal heir and stray cat we can't be seen feeding. You live in the countryside now, exiled from court, but surrounded by expensive tutors. Because even disgraced daughters are expected to be brilliant. You learn Latin before you can spell your own name, read Greek before most nobles can read anything, and spend your afternoons politely pretending not to notice when courtiers whisper about your mother's unfortunate past. Your father, Henry VIII, does not visit. He's busy producing sons with other women, or killing them when they disappoint him. You don't take it personally. He forgets people exist all the time. Still, every new royal birth is a reminder that you're replaceable. When your half-brother Edward is born, England throws a parade. When you sneeze, no one writes about it. At meals, your attendants bow too low and talk too little. You're technically a princess, but one without status, affection, or inheritance. A sort of royal paperweight. You study harder than anyone expects you to, because studying is the only thing you can control. Every grammar rule memorized, every Latin verse recited, is one more brick in the wall you're quietly building between yourself and humiliation. Your only real stability comes from your tutors, who notice something dangerous in you. Intellect. You absorb knowledge like oxygen, and that terrifies people. Intelligent women in Tudor England don't get rewarded. They get accused of witchcraft. So you learn another essential Tudor skill, smiling just enough to look harmless. When your father finally dies in 1547, you don't cry. It's hard to miss someone you mostly knew from paintings. The throne passes to your brother, and you, the brilliant bastardized daughter, remain where you've always been, hovering near power, watching it destroy everyone who touches it. But deep down, you already know your time will come. You've survived shame, exile, and the constant background noise of gossip. And if you've learned anything so far, it's this. Being unwanted has its advantages. No one sees you coming. You're 14 now, old enough to read Latin fluently, quote Cicero, and apparently ruin your reputation without even trying. After years in the countryside, you're invited to live with your stepmother, Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. She's smart, kind, and astonishingly alive for a Tudor queen. You think you might finally have a mother figure. Enter Thomas Seymour, Catherine's new husband, and England's reigning expert in bad decisions. He's handsome, ambitious, and allergic to boundaries. The man could flirt with a brick wall and somehow make it political. Unfortunately, he decides you're the wall. At first, his behaviour is dismissed as playful. He sneaks into your chambers at dawn, tickles you while you're still half asleep, and cuts your dresses for fun. Catherine laughs it off, because in Tudor England, harassment isn't scandalous unless it becomes paperwork. You don't understand why this feels wrong, but you do understand danger when you smell it. And this man smells like it. And expensive cologne. Eventually, Catherine catches the two of you in what historians call a compromising situation. You call it standing near a man in the 1500s. You're sent away immediately, your household dissolved, your maids interrogated, and your name dragged through every corridor in London. The Privy Council investigates. Old men with dusty wigs and sharper tongues demand to know if you encouraged him, as if 14-year-olds run the country now. You deny everything, because in a way you've learned from the best. Your father survived scandals by pretending not to notice them. You do the same. Catherine Parr dies soon after childbirth. Thomas Seymour tries to marry you next, because nothing says trustworthy guardian like a man who flirts with his teenage ward and then proposes marriage. He's executed for treason before he gets the chance. When it's all over, you emerge technically innocent, but permanently tainted. You've learned your first adult lesson. Men can destroy your reputation faster than the plague, and you'll always be the one who has to survive the cleanup. You stop trusting charm, you stop trusting love, and you start practicing your smile, the one that hides everything dangerous behind silence. Your teenage years end the way most Tudor stories do, with someone else being crowned, and you quietly wondering how long it'll take before they try to kill you. Your half-brother Edward VI becomes king at 9 years old, which is about 6 years past the average Tudor life expectancy. You play the role of the supportive sister, polite, educated, invisible, while the real power sits with the men around him. They call it a regency council. You call it the same old patriarchy, but now with powdered sleeves. For a while, things are calm. You study, write letters, and pretend you're not constantly being watched. But the moment Edward dies, the entire country panics, because no one wants your other half-sister, Mary Tudor, to take the throne. She's Catholic, she's angry, and she has a list. You stay out of it. You've learned to survive by not picking sides, a skill that will serve you well when everyone else starts losing their heads. Mary becomes queen anyway. England rejoices for about 3 days before she starts burning Protestants alive. You keep your head down, which in this era is not a metaphor. But then, predictably, someone drags your name into a plot to overthrow her. You're arrested, hauled off to the Tower of London, and placed in the same fortress where your mother died. It's damp, cold, and full of the sound of people not making it out. The guards won't meet your eyes, and the walls smell like fear and mildew. You sleep in the shadow of a scaffold, fully expecting to use it soon. You write letters to Mary begging for mercy, not because you expect her to read them, but because it's what you're supposed to do before execution. Weeks pass. Nothing happens. Mary spares you, either out of guilt, politics, or the faint memory that you share a father who ruined both your lives. You walk free, pale, shaken, but alive. And that's the day you realise what kind of queen you'll need to be if you ever sit on that throne, charming enough to be adored, ruthless enough to stay alive, and paranoid enough to never sleep again. It's 1558, and after years of imprisonment, interrogation, and pretending to be unimportant, you've finally outlasted everyone who wanted you dead. Your half-sister Mary Tudor dies, probably from stress, guilt, or bad timing, and suddenly, you're queen. Congratulations, you've just inherited one of the most dysfunctional kingdoms in Europe. England is broke, half Catholic, half Protestant, and one sermon away from civil war. Your advisors are old men who think women should only rule kitchens, not countries, and your royal treasury? It's emptier than your father's wedding vows. The coronation is magnificent, of course. Gold banners, ringing bells, crowds screaming your name as if trauma has been cancelled. Everyone's thrilled to have a fresh start. You, on the other hand, know better. Nothing in England ever starts fresh. It just gets repainted. You're 25, terrified, and completely alone. Marriage seems like the logical next step. The entire court won't shut up about it. The ambassadors write home daily, speculating which lucky man will tame the fiery Elizabeth. France offers princes. Spain offers alliances. Even Robert Dudley, your childhood friend, offers affection, though his wife's existence makes that complicated. But you've seen what marriage does to women in your family. Your mother lost her head over it. Your stepmothers lost their lives, their sanity, and in some cases, their necks. You know the truth. Marriage isn't partnership. It's surrender. So you turn the concept into a political game. You flirt with kings to buy time, promise heirs you'll never have, and let every nation believe they still have a chance. It's diplomacy through strategic indecision. Behind the curtain, you never stop working. You study treaties, count coins, and learn to balance charm with quiet menace. You smile like a saint and think like a spy. Every decision must please everyone and offend no one. A task slightly harder than inventing flight. When people praise you, it feels hollow. When they criticize you, it feels familiar. You rule through performance, and your crown starts to feel more like a collar. Still, you endure. Because in Tudor England, survival is success. And as you take your seat on the throne, you finally realize the awful truth of power. Being queen doesn't mean freedom. It just means you're the last one left to blame. You're queen now, which sounds glorious until you realize it mostly involves pretending to be flawless for people who secretly hope you'll fail. Every waking moment is a performance. You can't sneeze without it being interpreted as foreign policy. Your morning routine could pass for a military operation. First comes the wig, a towering construction of hair and symbolism. Then the white paste, a thick coat of lead-based makeup meant to make you look eternally young and divine, which, unfortunately, is also eating your skin alive. It burns, it cracks, and it slowly poisons you. But what's a little nerve damage compared to appearing immortal? Your courtiers call you radiant. They mean it literally. The lead has given your face a faint, reflective sheen. You smile through the pain, because that's your job. Not to rule, but to reassure. England must believe its queen is perfect, eternal, and utterly in control. Even when your heart skips from exhaustion and your hairline has fled for safety. The portraits help. You command artists to paint you as a goddess. No wrinkles, no shadows, no humanity. The image works so well that even your enemies start to believe it. You become less of a woman and more of an icon, a glowing marble statue with a pulse. It's brilliant propaganda, and a personal nightmare. At court, perfection is survival. Any hint of weakness becomes gossip by noon and a political rumour by supper. You can't afford friends, only spectators. The ladies in waiting who dress you whisper behind fans. Ambassadors take notes on how tired you look. One wrong word, one slip of temper, and someone somewhere writes to Spain that the Queen's mind weakens. So you double down. You smile harder, speak softer, and wield charm like a dagger. You never cry where anyone can see you. Never show illness. Never admit you might be lonely. Every day you build the myth a little higher. Elizabeth the Glorious, Elizabeth the Eternal, the Virgin Queen, until even you start forgetting where the act ends and the person begins. And when the candles go out at night, you wipe the makeup away, stare into the mirror, and wonder quietly how much of you is left underneath the paint. Every morning you wake up to the same question from your council, your courtiers, and half of Europe. So, Majesty, have you picked a husband yet? It's not curiosity. It's a threat disguised as small talk. Because in their minds, a queen without a king is a problem waiting to happen, like a carriage missing a wheel, or a candle burning without permission. You've been queen for years now, and somehow you've managed to stay single. That alone feels like witchcraft. Ambassadors write anxious reports to Madrid and Paris. Her Majesty remains obstinately unmarried. You can practically hear the panic echoing across the channel. You play the game masterfully. When Philip of Spain sends a proposal, you smile and stall. When the Archduke Charles tries, you smile and stall again. When Robert Dudley, your oldest friend and the most dangerous option of all, gets too close, you send him away, twice. Because the one thing worse than scandal is scandal with feelings. With, you've seen what marriage does to women like you. Your mother lost her head over it. Your sister Mary lost her crown. Your stepmother's lost, well, everything else. So you invent a new kind of monarchy. One where you flirt with nations but marry none. You are both the bride and the dowry, the promise and the punishment. Still, the loneliness creeps in. You catch yourself watching Dudley too long across the council table. You see his hand tremble when he bows. You both know what this could be, and what it would cost. Then his wife conveniently falls down a staircase and dies. The rumours arrive before her funeral does. You don't attend either. The court gossips, foreign rulers speculate, and poets romanticize. The Virgin Queen, they call you, though not with kindness. You let them. Chastity, after all, makes excellent branding. You wear the title like armour. Every country wants your hand, so none can touch your throne. Every man dreams of possessing you, but you belong to no one, not even yourself anymore. And so you master the art of saying perhaps with a smile that means never. Because the truth is, marriage would have made you someone's wife. Remaining single made you a legend. Welcome to your court, the glittering, perfumed, poison-tipped heart of your empire. On the surface, it looks divine. Velvet gowns, jewelled necks, gold reflections of candlelight on marble floors. But underneath all that silk and ceremony slithers a truth you learned too young. Everyone here smiles with their teeth, not their hearts. Your courtiers adore you in public and betray you in private. Their letters travel faster than their loyalty. You know which ones write to Spain, which ones whisper to France, and which ones pretend they don't. The trick is never to let them know you know. You've turned suspicion into an art form. Part queen, part detective, part exhausted babysitter of the ambitious. Your chief minister, William Cecil, is loyal, but only because you let him think his advice is his own idea. Your spymaster, Francis Walsingham, fills your court with informants disguised as servants, musicians, even confessors. They listen, report, disappear, and reappear with more gossip. You rule a country of listeners. Sometimes you wonder if even your walls are writing letters at night. You've created what historians will later call an intelligence network. You just call it survival. In a world where women are expected to be ornamental, you weaponize charm into strategy and paranoia into policy. You smile, flatter, and forgive, and then quietly destroy those who mistake your mercy for weakness. It's exhausting work. You can't eat without wondering who's tasted it first. You can't walk through the gardens without someone hiding behind the hedges taking notes. Even your ladies-in-waiting play double agents, gossiping for favours that vanish by morning. Sometimes, late at night, you envy the peasants. No one's plotting their overthrow. Their enemies are rats, not relatives. But then you remember, you'd rather be the spider in the web than the fly that gets caught in it. So you keep the mask on. You laugh at jokes you've heard 100 times. You dance with men who want your throne. You pour wine for the same hands that might be sharpening daggers tomorrow. And when you stand above them, calm, radiant, terrifying, you remember what your mother's death taught you best. In a world full of vipers, the only way to survive is to smile wider and bite first. You've survived political plots, bad suitors, and the English weather. But now comes the most dangerous threat of all, family. Her name is Mary, Queen of Scots, your cousin and the most inconvenient relative in all of Europe. She's glamorous, Catholic, and absolutely terrible at politics. Imagine the exact opposite of you. All charm, no caution. She marries unwisely, alienates her nobles, and somehow manages to make being royal look like a group project gone wrong. Eventually, she flees Scotland after a small civil war, which is impressive considering she started it. And where does she run for safety? England. To you. Because nothing says smart decision like seeking refuge with a woman whose throne you technically have a claim to. You don't want her here. You can feel the Catholic nobles twitching with excitement already. Mary is everything they think a queen should be, soft, feminine, and blessed by the Pope. You, meanwhile, have been excommunicated and wear lead makeup thick enough to stop a musket ball. But if you send her away, she'll plot abroad. If you keep her, she'll plot at home. So you lock her up. Politely, of course. She gets castles, servants, and embroidery. It's practically royal house arrest. For 19 years. You visit occasionally in letters. Distant, careful, never personal. She writes back in flowery apologies you don't believe. Then your spies intercept a letter. A new plot to assassinate you and put Mary on the throne. The Babington plot, they call it. You read her coded reply with the kind of detached disappointment usually reserved for spoiled wine. You don't want to kill her. You really don't. But you also like your head attached to your body, and history has already shown what happens when Tudors get sentimental. So you sign the warrant. The executioner does his job, and when the axe falls, it's not triumph you feel, it's dread. Because in that moment, you've killed more than a rival. You've killed the last person alive who truly understood what it means to wear a crown. And for the first time in your reign, the silence afterward feels heavier than the applause. The year is 1588, and congratulations, the most powerful man in Europe wants you dead. Philip of Spain, your ex-brother-in-law and professional sulker, has decided to invade England. His reason? Religion, revenge, and the general principle that women shouldn't run countries. He builds the Spanish Armada, 130 ships strong, loaded with guns, gold, and self-confidence. The priests bless it, the poets praise it, and the sailors assume it'll be easy. You, meanwhile, have an aging navy, limited funds, and the distinct feeling that England's destiny might come down to the weather. Your advisors panic. You don't. You give one of history's most famous speeches instead. At Tilbury, in armour, on horseback, surrounded by soldiers who can't decide if they're inspired or terrified. You tell them you have the heart and stomach of a king, which ironically is truer than you'd like to admit after years of Tudor stress-eating. The moment becomes legend. But here's the secret. After the speech, you go back to your chambers, take off the armour, and nearly collapse. You're exhausted, anxious, and half-poisoned by the very makeup that keeps your public face shining. Meanwhile, divine intervention arrives in the form of English weather. Storms shred Philip's navy like wet parchment. The invincible armada limps home in pieces. You've won, though technically so did the wind. Still, you take the credit. You deserve it. You've held your kingdom together through charm, caution, and the occasional gust of divine assistance. London erupts in celebration. Bells ring, poets write, and the streets smell like victory and unwashed bodies. They call you Gloriana, the Saviour Queen, the goddess who defied Spain. You smile, wave, and retreat behind your mask of white paint. But victories, like makeup, crack with time. You know the truth. The war nearly bankrupted you. Your navy is in ruins, and your health is quietly unravelling. Beneath the lead and the lace, your skin burns and your teeth ache. You can't feel your fingertips anymore. Still, you keep the smile. You let them see Elizabeth the Conqueror, not Elizabeth the Mortal. Because queens aren't allowed to age, only to fade beautifully. And you, ever the perfectionist, plan to do even that on your own terms. You've won wars, outsmarted assassins, and survived a childhood most people wouldn't survive a week of. Yet somehow, the thing you're most famous for isn't your political genius or your iron will. It's the fact that you've never been married. The Virgin Queen. It started as an insult, then became a weapon, and now it's a brand. You've turned chastity into statecraft. In an age obsessed with heirs, you've made not having one the cornerstone of your power. You are England's bride, your body the kingdom's property, your virtue its national security policy. Congratulations. You've become the world's most dignified hostage. Your portraits show you as ageless, radiant, divine, all white silk and starlight. In reality, your skin burns under the makeup, your teeth ache, and your back feels like it's negotiating surrender. But the illusion must hold. The poets compare you to goddesses, which sounds flattering until you realise that most of those goddesses ended badly. Behind the glory, there's the cost. You can't love, you can't trust, you can't even sneeze without a dozen diplomats wondering if it's symbolic. The same men who praise your divine wisdom also gossip about your wrinkles. Courtiers bring you mirrors like offerings, though you've long stopped enjoying what stares back. You sometimes think of Robert Dudley, the man who loved you before you became an institution. He's dead now, and his absence lingers like perfume in a locked room. You never married him, not because you didn't want to, but because England would have never forgiven you for choosing your heart over your crown. Queens don't get to make human mistakes, only national ones. So you embrace the myth. You are Gloriana, Astria, the untouchable light of Albion. It's lonely work, being a symbol. You attend masques, approve poetry, sign death warrants, and go to bed surrounded by silence. You tell yourself it's worth it, that the world will remember you as the queen who needed no man. But on some nights, when the palace is still and your crown sits forgotten on the table, you wonder what it would have been like to be remembered as a woman instead. Time, like the court gossip, never shuts up. You're older now, though no one's allowed to say it. The portraits still show you ageless, radiant, and surrounded by golden suns, as if denial itself could stop decay. But in truth, your hair is thinning, your teeth are crumbling, and your hands shake when you write. The price of being eternal is starting to show. Your oldest friend, Robert Dudley, is gone. His death hits you like a ghost slipping into the room. You find his final letter, sealed and waiting for you, and keep it in a box labelled simply, his last letter. You never open it. You don't need to. You already know what it says, and the knowledge is both comfort and punishment. You were the queen he loved, and the woman who could never love him back. The younger generation fills your court now, eager, polished, and utterly ungrateful. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, becomes your new favourite, mostly because he reminds you of the old one. Charming, reckless, and stupid in exactly the same way. You spoil him, tolerate him, and then, inevitably, have to execute him. Because that's what happens when men mistake your affection for weakness. The day Essex dies, you stay in your chambers. No speeches, no music, just silence, and the faint smell of the candles burning too low. You once ruled through fear and fascination. Now you rule through habit. The crown feels heavier, your counsel louder, and your patience thinner. You start seeing ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, the memory kind. You see your mother in every polished mirror, your father in every demand for loyalty, Dudley in every dream, and Mary Stuart in every doubt. The past won't stay buried. It sits beside you, whispering that all this glory came at the cost of everyone you ever cared for. And still, you smile for your courtiers. You joke, you dance, you pretend. Because that's what queens do. They turn grief into ceremony and heartbreak into performance. But in the quiet hours of the night, when even the spies are asleep, you whisper into the dark, not a prayer, not a confession, just a name. And then you fall silent again, because history doesn't care if queens are lonely, only if they last. You've outlived them all. The lovers, the enemies, the poets, the fools. Even the mirror seems reluctant to keep up. You are 70 now. Or rather, you are whatever age your portrait says you are. The face on the canvas still glows like divine sunlight. The one in the mirror looks like the afterimage. Your hair, once aflame, is now a memory padded with wigs. Your smile, once clever, now trembles under the weight of too many speeches and not enough sincerity. You've spent 40 years pretending to be immortal, and somehow it worked too well. People have stopped treating you like a person. You are no longer Elizabeth. You are Her Majesty, an idea, a relic, a ghost who still pays taxes. Your council tries to talk succession, but you refuse. Naming an heir means admitting an ending, and endings are for mortals. Besides, every time someone inherits in this family, someone else loses a head. You keep the subject closed with a look, the kind that freezes even the boldest advisor into respectful panic. The younger courtiers still flatter you, though the enthusiasm feels more like pity now. They call you radiant. You thank them politely while wondering if they mean still breathing. When you dance, they cheer as though the act itself is miraculous. And in a way, it is. Your bones ache, your joints protest, and your once sharp mind flickers like candlelight. Your palaces have become mausoleums filled with laughter that isn't yours. You wander their halls dressed in white, draped in jewels that shine brighter than your eyes ever could. Servants whisper that the queen never sleeps anymore. And they're right. Sleep feels too much like surrender. When you do sit still, you listen for footsteps that never come. No husband, no children, just the distant echo of power fading into history. The price of being England's eternal mother is realizing you will die childless, heirless, and surrounded by people rehearsing how to mourn you. So you rise each morning, powder the ghost, and perform the miracle one more day. Because as long as England believes you're still strong, maybe you can pretend you are. And in a way, you've become exactly what you always feared. Not a woman, not even a queen, but a legend trapped in her own shadow. It's 1603, and you've reached the final act of your long, stubborn reign. The kingdom is stable, the empire growing, and your legend already secure. But legends, unlike people, don't get tired. You do. Your health collapses like a treaty written by men. The paint no longer hides the sickness, and your courtiers avoid mentioning how your hands tremble when you lift your cup. You refuse the physician's leeches. You've survived worse than bad blood. What frightens you isn't death. It's losing control of your own ending. You stop eating, stop sleeping, stop sitting. The doctors beg you to lie down. You refuse. Queens don't recline. They endure. So you stand, hour after hour, draped in black velvet, like a monument, unwilling to admit it's a statue. Servants sneak cushions under your feet. You kick them away. They whisper that you're talking to ghosts now. Your mother, your father, Robert Dudley. Maybe you are. They've been haunting you for years anyway. You murmur to the shadows about duty, power, and how none of it feels as heavy as the crown once did. The courtiers outside your door listen, afraid to interrupt in case you decide to outlive them again. When at last your strength gives out, you sink to the floor. It's almost funny. After a lifetime of defying gravity, your body insists on reminding you that queens are made of bones, not marble. Your counselors rush in, panic written across faces that have seen too much history. You say nothing. You just stare at the crown on the table, the one thing you could never wear without bleeding for it. In your final hours, you finally do what no one expected. You smile, faintly, maybe at the irony, that after 4 decades of power, you'll be remembered as the Virgin Queen, as if your greatest achievement was staying single. Or maybe you're smiling because you realize something better. You didn't need heirs. You became one. When death finally comes, it's quiet. No screams, no spectacle, just the soft rustle of a monarch stepping out of her costume. And somewhere in the stillness, England holds its breath, because for the first time in 44 years, the throne is empty, and the ghost of Elizabeth Tudor finally sits down. It begins with the smell. Not of death itself, but of the strange concoctions people burned to ward it off. Sweet herbs, vinegar vapours, crushed roses, garlic, and sometimes, mercifully, something unidentifiable. You walk through a street in 1347, and it feels like the entire world is both decaying and trying desperately to perfume its own funeral. The air is thick with the stench of fear disguised as medicine. Doctors, or what passed for doctors, shuffle around in their long cloaks and bizarre beaked masks. Each mask's nose is stuffed with lavender, mint, and camphor, a sort of mobile potpourri they believed could purify the pestilent air. It looked more like a bird costume than medical attire, but in an age when people thought bad smells caused disease, the logic made sense. You'd probably have worn one too if you thought sniffing time might save your life. As you pass by, church bells toll constantly. Not for prayer times, but for funerals. People light fires in their homes, not for warmth, but to cleanse the air. Families toss handfuls of herbs into the flames, sage, rosemary, juniper, and hope the smoke will keep the plague from seeping through their windows. Some even believed the scent of roses could repel death itself. Roses! As if the Grim Reaper were simply allergic to florals. The real doctors, university men with Latin scrolls and clean hands, were useless. They debated endlessly whether the plague came from corrupted air, a misalignment of planets, or perhaps God's wrath. Meanwhile, the people on the streets tried everything. They rubbed onions on their skin. They drank vinegar like it was holy water. Some even stuffed crushed emeralds into their mouths because a wealthy Venetian once claimed it absorbed poison, and if you were lucky enough to afford a physician, he'd probably bleed you dry, literally, under the belief that illness was caused by bad humours. You'd sit there, dizzy and half dead, while he proudly announced you were cured of imbalance. The irony, of course, was that the only thing the treatment truly balanced was the number of graves. By the end of the week, even the healthiest-smelling lavender couldn't hide the truth. Death wasn't afraid of perfume. It was everywhere. Sweet, pungent, and unstoppable. When the herbs failed, people turned to pain. Not the kind you treat, but the kind you inflict, on yourself, publicly, for God to see. Across Europe, processions of men and women began marching from town to town, chanting hymns and beating themselves bloody with whips tipped in iron or knotted cords. They were called flagellants, and they believed their suffering could atone for humanity's sins and stop the plague. Spoiler, it didn't. Imagine the scene. A long line of pilgrims, half naked, their backs already raw from earlier lashes, trudging barefoot through muddy streets. Children cry, old women cross themselves, and the smell of rot mixes with sweat and sanctity. With every crack of the whip, blood splatters onto the cobblestones. It's part ritual, part horror show, and part very bad science experiment. They sing hymns about mercy as they bleed, convinced their pain buys forgiveness in bulk. Some towns welcomed them like saints. Priests would bless their procession, bells would ring, and townsfolk would join in, hoping a little collective misery might scare the disease away. Other cities, however, saw them as dangerous fanatics. In places like Strasbourg and Cologne, flagellant groups became so disruptive, preaching against the church, spreading panic, and occasionally carrying the plague with them, that even the Pope had to issue a ban. Imagine getting excommunicated for loving God too loudly. The psychology behind it was simple and tragic. If the Black Death was God's punishment, then maybe he just needed to see people were sorry. The whips were their apology letters written in flesh. And yet, the more they marched, the more the plague spread. Blood, sweat, and open wounds made perfect incubators for disease. Some cities even reported new outbreaks following the flagellant's arrival. Divine irony, if there ever was one. In a way, they were medieval influencers, spreading a trend no one really wanted, but everyone copied out a fear of missing salvation. For a few brief years, the roads of Europe echoed not with trade or music, but with the rhythmic crack of self-punishment. And when even that failed to stop the dying, humanity began to realize a grim truth. No amount of faith, flowers, or flagellation could cleanse a world that didn't understand its own sickness. By 1348, Europe was crawling with doctors, alchemists, astrologers, and complete frauds, all confidently diagnosing a disease they didn't understand. In every town, you could find a man selling miracle tonics in glass bottles that looked suspiciously like coloured water. Some claimed to distill antidotes from crushed pearls, while others offered elixirs made from snake oil, mercury, or even powdered mummy. Yes, literal ground-up corpses imported from Egypt. Nothing says healthcare quite like a dash of pharaoh dust. If you were wealthy, your treatment came with better packaging. Nobles hired personal physicians who charged a fortune to read the stars before deciding whether to bleed you or burn herbs. One popular theory blamed the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars for poisoning the air. So, if you died, it wasn't your doctor's fault, it was astrology. The universe had simply scheduled your demise. For the poor, medicine looked more like improvisation. Local wise women brewed potions out of garlic, honey, and crushed frogs. Others prescribed carrying a dried toad around your neck to draw out the poison. If that didn't work, you could always sit between two roaring fires until you nearly fainted. Theoretically, the heat scared the disease away. Realistically, it just roasted the patient. Then, there were the opportunists, the travelling quacks who sold fake relics and holy powders from saints' bones that were probably just crushed chalk. They wandered from village to village, leaving behind lighter purses and heavier graves, some even dressed as plague doctors, beak and all, to look professional. You'd think the long robe, leather gloves, and ominous crow mask would inspire confidence, but it mostly terrified people. And still, they paid. Yet, among all the nonsense, a few healers genuinely tried. They burned infected clothes, isolated the sick, and noticed, though couldn't explain, that those who avoided contact with others tended to survive. These were the accidental pioneers of quarantine, centuries before the word existed. Still, for every careful observer, there were a dozen confident fools mixing vinegar and unicorn horn in a pot. Medicine had become theatre. If you looked like you were fighting the plague, people believed you were. It didn't matter that your cure did nothing. Hope, even false hope, was the only thing keeping anyone sane. When logic failed, people turned to fire. Cities across Europe began lighting massive bonfires, not to celebrate, but to cleanse. It was believed that heat could drive out the corrupted air, the invisible miasma carrying death. In towns like Florence and Paris, the smell of burning herbs, wood, and sometimes entire piles of clothes filled the streets. You could hear the crackle of hope and hysteria mixing together in the smoke. People threw anything remotely suspicious into the flames. Old bedding, straw mattresses, cats, even personal letters that might carry the plague. The richer folk added perfumes and resins to their fires, trying to make death smell pleasant. Poorer families just burned whatever they could find. mostly damp wood that filled the alleys with choking fumes. The irony was thick enough to taste. People suffocating themselves in an effort to breathe clean air. City officials organised purification days, ordering every household to light fires simultaneously so the collective heat might lift the plague into the heavens. Some believed the smoke would rise to God and show that the city was taking action. Others, more desperate, thought it might physically push the disease away. In both cases, the logic went up in smoke. Then came the bonfires of superstition. Rumours spread that certain groups had poisoned the wells or brought the sickness through witchcraft. Fear turned pyromaniacal. Suspected witches, foreigners, and even lepers were dragged from their homes and thrown into flames, meant for purification. The fires no longer cleansed. They consumed. Meanwhile, inside homes, people burned herbs in small pots and carried them room to room like incense. Juniper, frankincense, and rosemary were the holy trinity of household fumigation. Doctors recommended burning sulphur and tar too, though that often led to fainting or worse. But if you passed out, at least you weren't coughing, so they counted it as progress. The whole ritual became a kind of performance art. People felt safer when they could do something. Anything. Watching smoke billow into the sky was a comforting illusion of control in a world that had lost all sense of it. The Black Death didn't vanish in the fire, but for a few brief, smoky moments, people could pretend it might. And in the face of unstoppable death, pretending was its own strange medicine. When the air turned foul and the plague crept through every crack and alley, vinegar became the medieval equivalent of hand sanitizer. If hand sanitizer burned your tongue and did absolutely nothing, people soaked everything in it. Clothes, sponges, coins, even themselves. Vinegar was cheap, sharp, and most importantly, smelled like effort. In an age without germ theory, that counted as medicine. Doctors prescribed vinegar baths, vinegar gargles, and vinegar compresses for buboes, the swollen black lumps that marked the body's surrender. One popular cure involved bathing in vinegar, infused with rose petals, then drinking the leftover liquid. It didn't heal anyone, but it did make death smell faintly floral. Some even believed vinegar had divine approval, claiming its sourness could cut through sin as well as sickness. If your throat burned, you were on the right track. Merchants quickly caught on to the craze. They sold special blends like Four Thieves Vinegar, a supposed plague-proof formula said to protect 4 cunning robbers who looted infected homes without getting sick. The recipe varied from place to place, sometimes garlic and rosemary, sometimes wormwood and lavender, but the story sold better than the product. You could buy a bottle at any market, along with the comforting illusion that you'd outsmarted the apocalypse. Of course, the more desperate the times, the stranger the applications. Some rubbed vinegar into open wounds, others washed their food in it until their bread dissolved. A few unfortunate souls even inhaled vinegar fumes directly through their noses, a medieval spa treatment for the truly brave or truly gullible. The richer classes turned it into ritual. Noble women carried silver pomanders filled with vinegar-soaked sponges, pressing them to their noses when servants coughed. It became a status symbol. Nothing said, "I can afford not to die," like sniffing your jewellery. Yet, beneath all the superstition, there was a faint glimmer of logic. Vinegar does kill some bacteria, though the plague wasn't one of them. Still, in an era when no one knew what germs were, it was one of the few treatments that didn't make things worse. For a brief moment, people believed salvation could be bottled, poured, and splashed liberally on fear itself. The world reeked of vinegar and of hope, gone sour. When vinegar and herbs failed, Europe turned its eyes upward. Surely if medicine couldn't cure the plague, maybe the saints could. After all, they were supposed to handle miracles. Every church overflowed with prayers, candles, and desperate bargaining. People crawled on their knees to altars, whispering promises to Saint Sebastian, the go-to plague protector. Why Sebastian? Because he'd been shot full of arrows, and arrows looked suspiciously like God's invisible punishment. Perfect metaphor. Wrong cure. Paintings of the time show townsfolk clutching little wooden icons of Sebastian, his body riddled with arrows yet annoyingly serene, as though being skewered was just another Tuesday. Others prayed to St. Roch, who famously survived a plague himself, with only a dog to bring him bread. He became the medieval equivalent of an influencer for divine health, except his followers kept dying anyway. In cities like Avignon and Florence, Priests organized massive processions. People marched barefoot, clutching relics, chanting for mercy as incense smoke filled the air. The Pope ordered prayers across Christendom and even blessed the rivers of Rome, hoping holy water might trickle salvation downstream. Unfortunately, the Black Death wasn't particularly pious. It drowned the faithful just as eagerly as the faithless. Some clergy tried to interpret the plague as divine messaging. "It's punishment for pride," they declared. "No, for greed," others shouted. Eventually, the church concluded it was for everything. You couldn't win. If you prayed, you were desperate. If you didn't, you were damned. Even monks who lived in isolation, eating little and praying much, started dropping dead. Apparently, holiness had no immunity. As panic grew, some took matters into their own blistered hands. People built small roadside shrines out of desperation, leaving coins, bread, or bits of jewelry to attract divine favour. Others tried to buy forgiveness in bulk, literally, by paying for masses to be said in their names after they died. The church's coffers swelled even as its priests fell ill. Faith became both medicine and business. And yet, when the bodies kept piling up, prayers began to falter. For the first time, people questioned whether the saints were even listening. The silence of heaven was deafening, interrupted only by the tolling of funeral bells. God, it seemed, was observing quarantine too. If divine mercy failed, there was always the blade. Medieval medicine adored the idea of balance, the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Get too much of one, and you were doomed. The solution? Drain some out. Simple, elegant, lethal. During the Black Death, physicians sharpened their knives and set to work like mechanics fixing a broken carriage, by removing the oil and hoping it would drive better. The process was straightforward. Slice open a vein, watch the blood flow, and pray you didn't faint first. Doctors swore it released poison from the body. Some even used leeches for a gentler touch, which was only slightly less horrifying. You'd lie there pale, dizzy and lightheaded, while your doctor confidently declared you were improving, because technically you were too weak to argue. Rich patients got premium service, silver bowls, perfumed bandages, and doctors quoting Aristotle while draining them. The poor just got cut and told to hold still. In many towns, barber surgeons, yes, your local haircut guy, did the bloodletting for a fraction of the cost. You could get a shave, a trim, and a vein opened all in one sitting. The famous red and white barber pole still seen today? It's a souvenir of that era. The red for blood, the white for bandages. Nothing says clean cut like a reminder of medieval hemorrhage. Even when patients died mid-procedure, doctors refused to admit defeat. He was too far gone, they'd say, wiping their knives. In their defence, it was the only method they had that felt scientific. It involved tools, ritual, and visible results, just enough to impress the desperate. Sometimes, when bloodletting didn't work, doctors recommended repeating it daily until the patient stabilised, which usually meant expired. Some patients rebelled, choosing instead to let nature or the saints decide. But refusing treatment was dangerous too. In certain towns, civic officials ordered plague victims to submit to medical care or face exile. So, people submitted, willingly or not, and bled themselves towards salvation. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at the absurdity. But for them, every drop of blood spilled was a prayer in liquid form, a bargain struck between faith and fear. And as Europe bled itself pale, the plague carried on, entirely unimpressed by human optimism or leeches. By 1349, Europe had turned into a giant perfume bottle, with a hint of terror. People believed the plague travelled through bad smells, so naturally, the solution was to drown the world in good ones. Apothecaries became celebrities overnight, selling scented waters, pomanders, and sachets to anyone who could still afford to breathe. It was the golden age of what could politely be called olfactory overcompensation. Nobles drenched themselves in rose oil, musk, and ambergris, the latter being whale vomit, which for some reason screamed luxury. Women carried little metal balls called pomanders, filled with cloves, cinnamon, and vinegar-soaked sponges. Every few minutes they'd press it to their nose like a medieval air freshener, pretending the scent could block out death. The result? Streets smelled like a mixture of incense, decay, and desperate hope, a fragrance no perfumer has dared to replicate. Public hygiene turned into performance art. City councils ordered the streets to be sprinkled with vinegar and flower water. In Paris, People burned piles of aromatic wood in public squares. In Venice, ships carrying spices and perfumes were prioritized at port, because surely cinnamon could defeat the apocalypse. Even doctors carried bouquets or posies to hold under their beaked masks, convinced the sweet aroma could filter out evil vapours. "A rose a day keeps the plague away," they said, possibly while standing next to a mass grave. For the poor, luxury perfumes were out of reach, so they improvised. Garlic necklaces became fashionable, if you define fashion as smelling like a cooking accident. Some chewed herbs constantly to perfume the breath, while others stuffed their clothes with dried flowers. Entire communities reeked of thyme, rosemary, and human panic. And when supplies ran low, people just rubbed anything fragrant on themselves. Juniper berries, lemons, or, in one tragic case, freshly baked bread. Perfume became both shield and social signal. The richer you smelled, the safer you were believed to be. Scent equaled virtue. Stench equaled sin. But as weeks passed and even the perfumed began to die, faith in fragrance faded. The air still shimmered with spice and smoke, but underneath it lurked the truth everyone tried to mask. No matter how sweetly you scented it, death still stank. By the plague's final years, Europe had officially lost its mind. Every town had its own secret cure, usually based on rumour, luck, or sheer insanity. If someone survived, their method instantly became gospel. You'd hear things like, "My cousin's neighbour rubbed chicken guts on his sores, and he's alive," which somehow convinced others to try it. Thus was born the infamous chicken cure, strapping a live, shaved chicken to your plague boils to draw out the poison. The poor bird usually died first, confirming the theory that it had absorbed the sickness. Never mind that it also absorbed dignity, others turned to astrology. If the stars had caused the plague, maybe they could also fix it. People adjusted their diets based on planetary positions, or refused to bathe on certain days because Mars was in opposition. Bathing, in fact, became controversial. Many believed water opened the pores to disease, so the cleaner you were, the quicker you'd die. The rich stopped washing altogether, layering perfume over filth like a scented bandage on civilization's corpse. There were also the earth cures. Some physicians claimed the ground itself could heal, advising patients to bury their feet or entire bodies in soil to draw out the plague. Others drank ground-up gemstones mixed with wine, because if you're going to die, you might as well sparkle on the way out. And then came the truly absurd. Swallowing crushed emeralds, rubbing excrement on sores, or even applying butter to wounds to soothe divine fire. Spoiler, it did not. Quarantine, ironically, was one of the few effective measures, discovered not by scholars, but by desperate city officials. In Venice, ships suspected of carrying plague victims were kept at sea for 40 giorni, 40 days. The practice saved thousands, but felt cruel at the time. Imagine watching the mainland from your window while your crewmates coughed beside you, praying the countdown didn't end in silence. By 1351, the Black Death had devoured up to half of Europe's population. The strange cures, from vinegar baths to chicken therapy, had failed spectacularly, but they revealed something profoundly human. People would rather do something wrong than nothing at all. In the face of invisible death, action, no matter how absurd, was its own form of faith, and sometimes faith was the only medicine left. In the year 793, Lindisfarne was as peaceful as heaven on earth could be. Perched on the northeastern coast of England, the monastery stood where land met sea, a sacred place that seemed untouchable by chaos. The monks who lived there followed the rhythm of prayer and tide. At dawn, the bell tolled softly across the salt wind. By candlelight, they copied scripture onto vellum, their ink-stained hands steady and faithful. To them, the outside world was distant and uncivilized. Their island was a fortress of faith, guarded not by walls, but by God himself. The sea, however, had its own plans. For centuries, the monks saw the ocean as a symbol of creation and mystery, a divine mirror reflecting heaven's order. But beneath its calm surface lay a truth they couldn't comprehend. It was also a road. And somewhere beyond the grey horizon, other men had been watching that road, men who worshipped not one god, but many. Men who spoke in thunder and carried axes that gleamed like firelight on steel. To them, the world wasn't a place to pray in, it was a place to take. The early summer of 793 had been unusually warm. Crops grew tall, The fish were plenty, and the monks took it as a sign of divine favour. They sang louder, gave thanks longer, and carried on as though heaven itself smiled on Lindisfarne. They didn't see the warning signs, driftwood from the north, strange sails rumoured by fishermen, or the whispers that reached from the Orkney Isles about sea wolves. Wolves, they said, that hunted across waves instead of forests. On June 8th, as dawn broke and mist rolled over the tide pools, a dark line appeared on the horizon. The monks thought it might be traders, or perhaps pilgrims. After all, who would dare bring violence to God's doorstep? But as the ships drew closer, their curved hulls and painted dragon heads told another story entirely. The quiet monastery, once a sanctuary of faith and learning, was about to meet a world that didn't believe in sanctuaries. The monks of Lindisfarne had spent their lives gazing toward heaven. They never thought death would come from the sea. The Vikings came not with warning, but with wind. Their ships, sleek, shallow-drafted, and impossibly fast, cut through the North Sea like razors through silk. Long, curved hulls carried them silently until they were almost upon the island. Each vessel bore a carved dragon's head on its prow, its eyes painted red as if to drink in blood. To the monks of Lindisfarne, who had never seen such things, it was as if monsters had risen from the deep. The raiders were young men hardened by endless winters, warriors from Norway, men who had grown up listening to sagas of gods who demanded courage and conquest. Their faith was in the storm, their prayers were war cries. They rode under grey skies, shouting to Odin and Thor for strength. Behind them trailed the smell of tar, sweat, and salt, the scent of the world that had sent them here. They weren't kings or generals. They were farmers, hunters, and fishermen, driven by hunger for silver, land, and glory. When the longships scraped against Lindisfarne's shore, there was no negotiation, no herald, no declaration of war. Just the thud of boots on wet sand and the shriek of gulls startled into the air. The first monk who saw them thought they were traders, until he saw the axes. Iron flashed. The sound of steel striking bone shattered the morning calm. The invaders moved swiftly through the monastery grounds, kicking open doors, overturning altars, tearing gold from crucifixes. Their fury seemed not random, but sacred, like a rival religion proving its god was stronger. The monks tried to resist, but their hands were trained for quills, not swords. Some fled to the cliffs, others knelt and prayed. A few stood their ground, clutching crosses as if faith could stop iron. It didn't. The Vikings had never seen such wealth gathered in one place. Goblets, illuminated manuscripts, jewelled reliquaries. To them, this was not desecration. It was divine justice. The gods of the north, they believed, rewarded the brave and took from the weak. By the time the sun reached its height, Lindisfarne was silent again, but no longer holy. Smoke rose from the ruined chapel, mingling with the sea mist. The waves carried away both blood and rumour, whispering the same message across every shore. The north had awakened. The attack on Lindisfarne was swift, but its echo lasted for centuries. In the chaos, the line between martyrdom and massacre blurred. Monks were dragged from their cells, struck down before their own altars. The sacred manuscripts they had spent decades copying, golden letters on fine calfskin, were torn, trampled, or thrown into the flames. Firelight flickered through the cloisters, dancing across broken icons and blood-smeared stone. To the Norsemen, this was not blasphemy. It was victory. To the survivors, it was the apocalypse. Those who managed to flee ran barefoot across the tidal flats, clutching relics to their chests, bones of saints, bits of wood said to come from the true cross, anything that might still hold power. Behind them, the Vikings tore through the monastery like wolves through a pen. They took what glittered, chalices, golden crucifixes, silver plates, and left behind what they couldn't carry, corpses and questions. The raiders didn't understand the horror they'd unleashed in the minds of Christian Europe. For them, monasteries were simply vaults guarded by unarmed men who kept their treasure under the name of a god that never fought back. They had struck not just a building, but an idea, the illusion that faith alone could shield civilization. The world beyond the North Sea learned that morning that the age of miracles had ended. Steel was the new scripture. By nightfall, the fires on Lindisfarne could be seen for miles along the coast. Fishermen in distant villages watched the orange glow and whispered of demons. Some claimed to hear screams carried by the wind. Others said angels wept in the sky. The next morning, The tide washed ashore fragments of the monastery's library, pages from the Gospels soaked and curling in the surf, their Latin words now unreadable, as though God himself had gone silent. The survivors buried their dead and wrote letters of lamentation. One monk described the scene as a harbinger of great terror, the beginning of sorrows. He was right. The raid on Lindisfarne was more than an act of violence. It was a message carved in fear. The sea, once seen as the boundary of Christendom, had become its door, and from that door the Vikings were just beginning to step through. News of Lindisfarne spread faster than any ship could sail. Within weeks, the story raced through monasteries and royal courts alike, a tale so shocking that many refused to believe it at first. An island of holy men, slaughtered by pagans from the sea. It sounded like a warning from Revelation itself. But soon, letters arrived from survivors, and the truth became undeniable. The North Sea, once thought to divide the faithful from the wild, had been crossed, and with it, Europe's sense of safety drowned. In monasteries across Britain, bells tolled for the dead of Lindisfarne. Priors and bishops met in candlelit chambers, whispering prayers that trembled into fear. Even King Ethelred of Northumbria was said to sit in stunned silence, unable to grasp how such men, godless wanderers from beyond the known world, had reached his shores. For generations, the Church had taught that divine favour protected Christendom. Yet, the monastery had fallen without a miracle, without warning, without mercy. Chroniclers called it a sign of God's wrath. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky before the great famine and the harrowing of the heathen men. To the people of the age, this wasn't poetry. It was evidence. The attack wasn't random. It was punishment. Maybe the monks had grown proud. Maybe the church had grown rich. Or maybe God had simply turned his face away. Panic spread along the coasts. Monks began fortifying monasteries, digging trenches and moving relics inland. Pilgrimages slowed, trade faltered, and every ship on the horizon was suddenly suspect. The Vikings, once just a rumour from the north, became the embodiment of chaos, a reminder that civilization was fragile and faith had limits. But amid the fear, fascination took root. Who were these sea raiders who dared to defy the Christian God? Tales of their strength, their ships, and their strange gods began to spread like wildfire. To some, they were monsters. To others, a dark omen. But to a few, they were something else entirely. A challenge. The raid on Lindisfarne had not only broken the peace of the church, it had awakened Europe to a terrifying truth. The age of the Northmen had begun, and no coast would ever sleep quietly again. Who were the men who struck Lindisfarne, the first to bring the fury of the North to Christian shores? To their victims, they were demons in human form. But in truth, they were farmers, traders, and explorers from the rugged coasts of Norway. Life in the north was beautiful, but brutal. The soil was thin, the winters long, and the seas ruled everything. To survive, these men learned to read the winds better than scripture, to carve ships that could dance over waves, and to fight without hesitation. When resources ran short, they did not beg. They sailed. Norse society was built on competition and courage. Every man sought drengskaper, honour through bold deeds. Staying home and farming was respectable. But to gain glory, to carve your name into song, you had to take risks. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just a grab for silver. It was a test of manhood, the kind that turned local warriors into legends. Those who returned with gold and stories would be hailed as heroes. Those who didn't, well, dying in battle was hardly shameful when Valhalla awaited. The men who led the raid likely came from western Norway, small coastal kingdoms ruled by ambitious jarls looking for fame. Their homeland was a patchwork of fjords, farms, and feuds. Raiding offered what politics couldn't: independence. If your chieftain ignored you, the sea never would. And across that sea lay Britain, a land rumoured to be rich, unguarded, and full of soft, praying men who believed their God would protect them. These Norsemen weren't savage brutes, despite the image history paints. They were planners. They chose Lindisfarne precisely because it was isolated, wealthy, and undefended. The monastery's treasures were easily spotted from the water, glittering in the sunlight. They likely observed for days before striking, waiting for low tide to make landfall quick and deadly. When the moment came, they moved with precision. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. To the monks, the attack felt like divine punishment. But to the Vikings, it was something simpler, a good day's work. They didn't yet know they'd changed the course of European history. They were just men returning to their ships, laughing, hauling their loot aboard, and rowing toward the horizon, unaware that the world they'd just shaken would never forget their names. For the Vikings, Lindisfarne was more than just a successful raid. It was a revelation. The monastery's wealth seemed endless. Gold chalices, jewelled crosses, silver altar plates, and manuscripts glittering with illuminated letters. To men who came from a land where even kings dined on wooden bowls, this was otherworldly. They had found a new kind of treasure, one not buried under mountains, but sitting in plain sight, guarded only by faith. They took everything that could be melted, traded, or worn. But it wasn't just greed that drove them, it was glory. Norse culture didn't measure success by coins alone, but by reputation. A man's name had to be remembered, sung around fires long after his bones were gone. To strike such a blow against a foreign god, to return home with the spoils of holy men, that was the stuff of sagas, and the bards would make sure every chieftain knew it. In the eyes of their gods, this was no sin. Odin rewarded courage, Thor loved strength, and Frey, the god of prosperity, surely smiled on those who seized it. Every axe swing at Lindisfarne, every chest of silver torn from an altar, was an offering to them, a tribute written in blood. Where Christians saw desecration, the Norse saw divine balance. If one god had grown too rich and complacent, it was only fair another took his share. The monks' treasures were divided among the warriors and their leader, with shares given according to rank and valour. Some pieces were melted down and reforged into arm rings or necklaces. Others were traded in distant markets, their sacred origins lost in translation. A chalice that once held communion wine might later hold mead in a smoky longhouse, lifted in a toast to Odin rather than Christ. Back home, tales of the raid spread faster than any sermon. Young men dreamed of joining the next expedition, and chieftains realised the sea could bring more wealth than any farm. The raid on Lindisfarne didn't just fill Viking purses, it filled their imaginations. What began as one raid became a model for countless others. The Norse gods, it seemed, had given their followers a sign. Across the sea lay endless fortune, and no one strong enough to stop them. The raid on Lindisfarne struck England like a nightmare that refused to end. Coastal villages began to whisper the word Viking, as if saying it aloud might summon them. Every shape on the horizon became a threat. Every ship's sail, a potential omen of fire and death. The English had faced wars before, against rival kings, against hunger, even against the devil in sermons. But this was something new. Their enemies didn't come from neighbouring lands or known tribes. They came from the mist itself, like phantoms born of the sea. In Northumbria, panic set in. The king and his nobles sent men to patrol the coasts, though no one really knew how to fight what they couldn't predict. The monks who had survived Lindisfarne were treated as holy witnesses, proof that the world was indeed unravelling. One of them wrote that it felt as if the end of days had arrived, and God had sent serpents upon us. Even those far inland began to feel the dread. Markets emptied, pilgrimages halted, and merchants refused to sail. Faith itself began to tremble. Church leaders tried to make sense of it all. Some said the Vikings were sent as punishment for sin, that the church had grown soft, indulgent, too rich for its own good. Others insisted it was a test of faith, a divine storm meant to separate the true believers from the false. But no amount of prayer stopped the fear from spreading faster than any plague. The people started fortifying abbeys, hiding relics, and burying gold beneath altars. Yet, deep down, everyone knew that when the next fleet appeared, even stone walls might not save them. The raid also forced kings to think differently. For centuries, monasteries had been symbols of peace and learning, untouchable sanctuaries. But now they were liabilities, rich, isolated, and undefended. Some rulers began organising coastal militias and building lookout posts, hoping to give warning before the next strike. But it was like trying to guard an entire ocean with a handful of men. Lindisfarne had been one attack, but it rewrote England's imagination. Fear became part of the landscape. woven into the waves, sung in prayers, carved into chronicles. The Vikings had taken more than treasure. They had stolen England's sense of peace. The shock of Lindisfarne did not stop at England's shores. It rolled across Europe like thunder, echoing through monasteries from Ireland to the Frankish Empire. Letters flew between bishops and kings, filled with outrage and disbelief. How could such godless men defy the Almighty and live? Charlemagne himself, ruler of the most powerful Christian empire, was said to be horrified. If even a holy island could fall, what was safe? Suddenly, the edges of Christendom no longer felt like borders. They felt like invitations. Monasteries began fortifying their walls, a concept once unthinkable. Places of peace became fortresses. In Ireland and Scotland, monks built their abbeys inland or behind stone towers, trading isolation for safety. Pilgrims became armed travellers, priests learned to wield swords, and kings began to look suspiciously at their coastlines. Every ripple of rumour about Northmen stirred panic. Even the Mediterranean traders heard tales of pale-haired warriors who struck without warning, vanishing before an army could be raised. The church framed the event as divine warning. Preachers thundered from pulpits about repentance and humility. The faithful were told to fast, to pray, to atone. For clearly, God had turned his face away. Some believed the world was entering its final age, a slow apocalypse where the sins of man had drawn monsters from the sea. Others saw it as a call to arms, a reason to harden faith with steel. Yet not everyone viewed the Vikings as pure evil. Among scholars and travellers, a darker fascination grew. The Norse were barbaric, yes, but also bold, organised, and terrifyingly efficient. How had such distant tribes mastered ships that could cross oceans faster than imperial fleets? How did they navigate by stars, wind, and instinct alone? Europe realised that these were not savages in skins. They were craftsmen, tacticians, and merchants when it suited them. The North had risen with discipline as much as fury. Trade routes began shifting. Merchants learned to pay for protection, and entire economies adapted to fear. Monks hid relics underground. Kings reinforced coasts. Fishermen stopped sailing alone. But for all the panic, there was awe too. The Vikings had cracked open Europe's illusion of divine safety, and what spilled out was both terror and wonder. The sea, once seen as the world's edge, had become its new beginning. When the smoke cleared over Lindisfarne, the world that emerged was not the same. That single raid in 793 was not just an act of violence. It was the first heartbeat of a new era. The Vikings had discovered something greater than treasure: opportunity. Word of the monastery's riches and the ease of its conquest spread through the fjords of Norway and Denmark like wildfire. Every chieftain, every ambitious farmer, every restless youth with a sword suddenly saw the sea in a new light, not as a barrier, but as a bridge to fortune. Over the next decades, more ships would follow. They struck Jarrow, Iona, and other holy sites, leaving behind the same mixture of horror and awe. What began as a single raid evolved into a pattern, then a strategy, then an age. The Viking Age had begun, not because the North grew stronger, but because Europe's confidence had been broken. The raiders had found their weak point: wealth without warriors, faith without walls. Lindisfarne became a legend, almost instantly. Chroniclers described it in trembling ink, calling it a harbinger of great terror. It became a symbol of fear to the Christians and of triumph to the Norse. Songs of the raid reached longhouses across Scandinavia, sung beside fires that burned late into the night. Fathers told their sons about the Golden Island across the sea, where even priests bled silver. Soon, shipbuilders worked faster, warriors trained harder, and the coastline of England became the frontier of a new, unstoppable movement. And yet, in a strange way, Lindisfarne connected two worlds that had never truly met. Out of its ashes came centuries of conflict, trade, and cultural exchange. The same Vikings who had come as destroyers would later settle, farm, and even convert to the very faith they had once shattered. But on that first day, they weren't conquerors or converts. They were simply explorers with axes, testing the edge of their world. The monastery's ruins would stand for generations, half rebuilt, half haunted, a monument to the moment when isolation ended. From that point on, no coast in Europe would sleep peacefully again. The North had found its voice in fire and steel, and the world would spend the next 3 centuries learning to listen. In the far-flung colonies of the 17th and 18th centuries, medicine was less about science and more about survival. Disease was as common as dust, and trained physicians were rarer than gold. Most towns relied on a handful of barber surgeons, practical men who could cut hair, draw teeth, bleed a fever, and amputate a leg, often in the same afternoon. Their tools were simple: a bone saw, a scalpel, a few leeches, and a bottle of rum to dull both the pain and the conscience. In colonial medicine, if it didn't kill you, it counted as a cure. Hospitals were almost non-existent. Treatment took place in taverns, barns, or the patient's own bed. Surgery was performed on rough wooden tables, wiped down with seawater, and anesthesia was a luxury no one could imagine. The only painkiller was strong drink and prayers. A patient about to lose a limb would be told to bite down while a friend held them still. Infection was inevitable, but no one understood why. Doctors thought pus was a good sign. Laudable discharge, they called it. Proof that the body was fighting back. In truth, it was sepsis taking root. Colonial doctors practiced under the shadow of ancient theories. The 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, still dictated diagnosis. If you were ill, your humours were out of balance, and balance could only be restored by force: bleeding, blistering, purging, or vomiting. Fevers were met with leeches, headaches were treated with bloodletting, and if you survived the treatment, you were declared cured, whether you actually were or not. Yet amid all the superstition, there was ingenuity. Colonists learned from indigenous healers who used local herbs and roots unknown to European medicine: willow bark for pain, tobacco smoke for resuscitation, and sassafras for fevers. These remedies often worked better than anything imported from London. Still, most colonial doctors dismissed them as heathen cures, even while secretly taking notes. In this world, medicine was a gamble. Every fever could be malaria, every rash a warning, every cough the start of the end. Yet people kept seeking cures, trusting the men with saws and spirits, because in a land so vast and untamed, even a bleeding barber was better than no healer at all. To understand colonial medicine, you have to understand its obsession with balance. The theory of the 4 humours ruled every diagnosis, every prescription, and every poor soul who came limping into a surgeon's chair. Illness wasn't seen as infection or virus. It was imbalance. Too much blood, not enough phlegm, an excess of yellow bile, a deficiency of black bile. A man's health was measured not by germs or organs, but by the temperament of his bodily fluids. If you fainted, they said you had too little blood. If you were angry, too much heat in the liver. It was a worldview that made no sense, yet it lasted centuries, partly because it was convenient. Almost every treatment began with taking something out of you. Bleeding was the colonial doctor's favourite cure-all. Fever, bleed. Headache, bleed. Melancholy, definitely bleed. Surgeons carried elegant brass or steel lancets designed to open a vein just enough to let the bad blood flow. Sometimes they used leeches instead, pressed gently to the skin until they swelled with crimson satisfaction. Patients often fainted or worsened afterward, but the doctor would nod sagely and declare, "The humours are rebalancing." And when bloodletting didn't seem enough, there were blisters. Physicians applied heated glass cups or caustic poultices to the skin, creating painful sores meant to draw out the illness. A patient with pneumonia might find his chest covered in blisters by morning, an act of devotion to medical theatre if nothing else. The same logic led to purges and vomit-inducing tonics. After all, if the body was unwell, it needed cleansing, no matter how violently. Colonial people endured these torments with remarkable faith. A doctor's visit was more ritual than science, a blend of pain, prayer, and placebo. Yet there was something comforting about the process. The more dramatic the treatment, the more one felt that something was being done. Still, whispers spread. Sailors and settlers noticed that the indigenous healers didn't bleed their patients to death. They brewed teas, used poultices, and somehow cured wounds that colonial doctors could only worsen. Quietly, a few curious minds began to suspect that perhaps the body didn't need to be drained to heal. But for now, bloodletting remained king, and the colonies bled willingly in the name of balance. In the colonial world, there was a fine line between the man who trimmed your beard and the one who sawed off your leg. And often, it was the same man. The barber surgeon was the backbone of early medicine, a craftsman with a steady hand, a sharp blade, and a stomach strong enough for anything. His shop sign usually showed a striped pole, red for blood, white for bandages, the very same symbol that survives outside barber shops today. Inside, customers came for a haircut or a cure, and sometimes left missing more than they expected. These men were practical, not philosophical. While physicians in London debated the balance of humours, barber surgeons in Boston or Barbados simply got on with it. They extracted teeth, set bones, stitched wounds, and amputated limbs when infection spread too far. Their surgical kits looked more like a carpenter's toolbox. Bone saws, scalpels, needles and clamps, polished from use. Their best friend was rum, for cleaning instruments, calming nerves, and numbing the screams. An operation without rum was unthinkable for both patient and surgeon. There were no anaesthetics, of course. Patients were held down by friends or assistants, while the barber worked quickly, timing his cuts between screams. A good surgeon wasn't the one who caused the least pain, he was the one who finished before the pain could kill you. Infection was a mystery, but everyone knew the smell of it. If a wound began to rot, the only cure was more cutting. When in doubt, amputate might as well have been the colonial motto. Yet barber surgeons were oddly respected. They were part healer, part craftsman, and part gambler. Some became local legends, known for saving soldiers on battlefields or pulling sailors back from the brink of death. Others were feared, their names whispered in dread after too many failed amputations. Their apprentices learned through watching, not books, by holding a lantern over a screaming man, or by sewing their first wound on a drunk who couldn't pay. They weren't scientists, but they were indispensable. In a world where disease came with every tide and battle left men in pieces, the barber surgeon was civilization's crude answer to chaos. He couldn't promise life, only a fighting chance, and a clean cut. If you lived in the colonies and got sick, your odds of recovery depended less on skill and more on what you happened to have in your pantry. Rum was the universal medicine, disinfectant, anaesthetic, painkiller, and morale booster all in one. Got a toothache? Gargle rum. Fever? Drink rum. Surgery coming up? Drink twice as much. A few surgeons even poured it directly onto open wounds, believing its sting meant it was killing the poison. In truth, it was mostly killing the patient's ability to care. Then there were the leeches, the quiet, wriggling assistants to nearly every colonial doctor. They were kept in jars of water like pickled grapes, prized for their ability to draw out bad blood. Physicians applied them to the temples for headaches, to the abdomen for stomach pains, and to the feet for fevers. Each leech could drink up to 10 times its weight in blood, and afterward, the doctor would smugly show the bloated creature as proof of a successful treatment. Patients often felt weak or dizzy afterward. Not surprising, since they'd just donated half a pint of themselves to medical superstition. For internal problems, purges and vomit tonics were the fashion. Mixtures of mercury, molasses, and herbs were served in generous doses, with predictable results. If you weren't purging, sweating, or bleeding, you weren't getting better. Or so the logic went. Colonial health advice could be summarised in one grim sentence. If it feels awful, it must be working. It must be, luck played a larger role than anyone admitted. 2 patients with the same illness might receive identical treatment. One would recover, the other would die. To doctors, that was just the will of God, or perhaps a patient's lack of moral virtue. Faith and medicine were deeply entangled. Sin and sickness were cousins. Repentance was often prescribed alongside rest. Still, amidst the chaos, a few remedies truly worked, often by accident. Rum and herbs sometimes did disinfect wounds. Leeches, in rare cases, relieved swelling, and when the body miraculously healed itself, the doctor took full credit. Colonial medicine was a game of chance played with blades, bottles, and prayers. And in that game, rum and leeches were the dice everyone kept rolling. While barber surgeons handled bleeding and battle wounds, the true guardians of life in the colonies were the midwives. These women were healers, counsellors, and witnesses to birth and death, often all in the same night. In an age before hospitals, childbirth happened at home, surrounded by neighbours and candlelight, with the midwife guiding everything from first contraction to final breath. For most women, she wasn't just a medical figure. She was hope itself, wrapped in linen and smelling faintly of herbs. Midwives had no formal training. Their wisdom came from experience, passed from mother to daughter, from mentor to apprentice, through whispered lessons learned on blood-stained floors. They knew which herbs could ease pain, which teas could stop bleeding, and which prayers to mutter when the baby came too soon. Chamomile, pennyroyal, and raspberry leaf were their trusted allies. But when things went wrong, when the baby was breech or the mother's strength faltered, there was little to do but pray louder and work faster. Despite their skill, colonial society viewed midwives with suspicion. The church approved of their service, but distrusted their power. A woman who could bring life into the world without a man's help was seen as both holy and dangerous. Whispers of witchcraft followed midwives everywhere, especially if their patients survived illnesses others did not. More than a few were accused of unnatural knowledge, as if survival itself were an act of sorcery. Still, communities depended on them. A good midwife was worth more than gold. She delivered babies in freezing cabins, aboard ships at sea, and in the heat of Caribbean plantations. Her hands knew no rest. When soldiers' wives went into labour, she was summoned before the priest, before the doctor. For all the authority men claimed over medicine, it was women who brought the next generation safely into the world, or tried to. Every birth was a gamble. Many mothers never rose from the bed again. Many babies never drew breath. And yet, life continued. Midwives washed the dead, then helped deliver the next child, often in the same room. In a brutal world ruled by infection and fear, their work bordered on the miraculous. They didn't promise safety, only presence. And somehow, that was enough. Long before European medicine set foot in the colonies, healing already had deep roots in the land. Indigenous peoples across the Americas possessed centuries of botanical knowledge, a living pharmacy drawn from forests, rivers, and fields. When settlers arrived, coughing, bleeding, and blistered from their own civilized cures, it was often indigenous healers who saved them. They introduced remedies that seemed like magic to European eyes: willow bark for pain, tobacco smoke for asthma, sassafras for fevers, and echinacea for wounds. To the colonists, these cures came from nature. To the indigenous, they came from balance, between body, spirit, and earth. European doctors trained in cities far from nature didn't trust such practices. They dismissed them as heathen or superstitious, even as they quietly adopted them when desperation demanded it. Colonial physicians soon found themselves trading silver and rum for herbs they couldn't name but knew worked. Some learned to combine native knowledge with old-world methods, creating a strange new hybrid of science and superstition: bloodletting followed by a poultice, prayer mixed with plant medicine. It wasn't progress so much as a truce between two worlds. In New England, settlers learned to use witch hazel to reduce swelling and yarrow to stop bleeding. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans and indigenous healers exchanged medicinal secrets, blending West African traditions with local plants to create what later became folk medicine. These healers often worked in secret, outside the colonial system, that saw their wisdom as a threat to authority. Yet their remedies spread quietly, even reaching the hands of colonial doctors, who would later take credit for discovering them. Herbal medicine offered something colonial surgery never could: gentleness. While barber surgeons relied on blades and blistering, herbalists trusted patience. A tea of chamomile or valerian for sleeplessness, mint for stomach pain, garlic for infection. These cures didn't require screams or rum, just time and knowledge. But as the colonies expanded, so did European arrogance. Indigenous healers were pushed aside, their practices branded as pagan, even as their plants filled colonial apothecaries. The settlers would build their hospitals and call their medicine modern, forgetting who had first shown them how to survive. Yet, in quiet kitchens and forest clearings, the old remedies endured, whispered, brewed, and remembered. Of all the enemies faced by colonial medicine, none were as feared as smallpox. It swept through towns and camps like invisible fire, leaving behind corpses and the scarred faces of survivors. For many, it was the true ruler of the colonies. No king, no general, no god could stand against it. When the disease struck, there was no mercy. The first signs, fever, aches, and spots, were enough to send families into hiding and entire communities into panic. Doctors and healers tried everything. They bled patients to release the fever, applied blisters to the skin, and doused victims in vinegar or rum. They burned herbs in sick rooms to cleanse the air, unaware that the virus was already in the lungs of everyone nearby. When desperation reached its peak, people turned to folklore, hanging red cloths over doorways, praying to saints, or bathing in cold rivers. Nothing worked. The unlucky ones died quickly. The lucky ones lived on, disfigured, but immune. Then, from the east, came a strange rumour, a method called inoculation. The idea was simple and horrifying. Deliberately infect a healthy person with a mild case of smallpox to make them immune later. The technique had long been used in Africa, India, and the Ottoman Empire, but Europeans dismissed it as barbaric until they started dying in droves. It was an enslaved African man, known as Onesimus, who taught the method to a Boston minister, Cotton Mather, during an outbreak in 1721. Mather faced outrage and accusations of witchcraft, but his inoculated patients survived at far higher rates than those left to fate. Even with this breakthrough, colonial surgery remained primitive. Scalpels were unsterilised, and operations were conducted in daylight to save on candles. Infection claimed more lives than the surgeon's blade ever saved. A soldier might survive amputation, only to die from a single fly's landing on his wound. Still, every so often, something remarkable happened. A patient lived. A fever broke. A wound healed. These rare victories gave medicine its fragile hope. For every failure and corpse, there was one survivor who swore by his doctor's hand, his midwife's herbs, or simply divine mercy. In that uncertain world, survival itself was considered proof that the cure had worked, even when it hadn't. When the colonies went to war, first against native nations, then against each other, and finally against the British Crown, medicine followed the armies into chaos. The battlefield surgeon became the most overworked and least envied man alive. His tent was the one place soldiers prayed never to visit. There was no antiseptic, no anesthesia, no mercy, only speed. A good surgeon could amputate a leg in under 2 minutes. A great one could do it while ignoring the screams. The air around military camps smelled of blood, sweat, and burnt cloth, as if death itself had taken up residence. Most battlefield surgery was triage in its crudest form. Doctors prioritised the men who might live, a broken arm before a gut wound, a clean cut before a shattered bone. They had no time for prayers. Assistants held the patient down, while the surgeon sawed through flesh and bone, tying arteries with silk thread or horsehair. The stump was dipped in rum or tar to seal it. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Gangrene crept in like a second enemy, devouring what the sword had spared. Yet, despite the horror, there was innovation. War forced practicality. Surgeons learned which tools worked best, which techniques kept soldiers alive long enough to fight another day. Amputation knives became shorter, saws sharper, bandages cleaner, relatively speaking. The chaos of war turned butchers into professionals, men who could identify a wound's fate with a single glance. And though infection remained a mystery, some surgeons began boiling their instruments or washing their hands between patients, guided by instinct rather than knowledge. Field hospitals were rarely more than barns or tents, the floors slick with blood and mud. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, whispering prayers or curses, their fates determined not by God, but by a man with a saw. Still, the surgeons endured, performing hundreds of operations a week, their hands shaking only after the work was done. War revealed the brutal truth of colonial medicine. It wasn't designed to heal, only to endure. And in enduring, it evolved. Each battlefield, each desperate amputation, pushed medicine a little closer to understanding its own savagery, and the price of survival. By the late 18th century, the colonies were changing, and so was medicine. The age of bleeding and blistering hadn't vanished, but cracks were forming in its authority. New thinkers began to question whether sickness truly came from bad air or imbalanced humours. Dissections, once considered sinful, were quietly performed in medical schools. In the cities, apothecaries turned from superstition to experimentation. And across the Atlantic, whispers of scientific revolution began to reach even the farthest colonial settlements. Hospitals, once seen as death traps for the poor, started to resemble places of study. In Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital, founded by Benjamin Franklin, became a hub for colonial doctors to share knowledge instead of rumours. Surgeons began recording cases and comparing results, noticing patterns that suggested disease might have causes other than divine punishment or moral failure. The old phrase, God's will, started giving way to observable symptoms. It was the first step toward modern medicine. Fragile, hesitant, but unstoppable, smallpox inoculation, once feared as witchcraft, gained credibility after saving countless lives during the American Revolution. Doctors who had once relied on rum and luck now carried notebooks, sketching wounds, and taking notes on recovery. Midwives and herbalists, long dismissed as folk healers, contributed quietly to the growing body of practical knowledge. Their herbs found new names in Latin, their techniques absorbed into formal medicine, though rarely credited. The shift wasn't purely noble. Medicine became a profession, and with it came hierarchy. Male physicians sought to regulate healing through licensing, pushing midwives and folk doctors aside. Yet, even as power consolidated, knowledge expanded. Anatomy books replaced superstition, microscopes began to appear, and chemistry crept into the apothecary's art. Slowly, the world that once treated fevers with leeches started to glimpse the idea of germs, invisible, deadly, and entirely real. By century's end, the colonies had transformed into nations, and their medicine stood at the same threshold. The bleeding bowls and bone sores remained, but so did curiosity, the one tool that had never dulled. From the chaos of barber surgeons and midwives, rum and herbs, a new age of medicine was being born. It was still imperfect, still dangerous, but for the first time, it was learning.